I think the fact he's probably with Egypt and he's probably not playing in the major tournaments as such, or maybe got a great chance of winning. I think it's either the Champions League or the major tournament. Normally, the player who excels in that. You're looking at sort of Vinny Jr. and Mbappe right now. Real Madrid looking really good, going for the Champions League. Liverpool will be in that conversation, but right now he's certainly the front runner. And Roy, what you just said there in terms of getting maybe more trophies and league titles, that could actually put him above probably Kenny Legacy and Steven Gerrard in sort of where he ranks in terms of Liverpool legends, because I think right now he's right on their shoulders.
Just say AFCON is a major tournament because a lot of people are at home saying people not taking that. Say, AFCON is a major tournament. Just so you don't.
No, I mean, Egypt are not going to win the World Cup, are they?
No, but AFCON is big, wasn't it? Remember when him and Mane was going through it and I'm just saying AFCon.
It's a fact. It's a fact. If you win the Euros or you win the Copa America, it's deemed to be big, so the AFCON is on the same level.
Hello and welcome along to the On the Whistle podcast. I'm your host, Zayn, Nabbi. Joining me today for this pint-size or bite-size edition, depending how you want to describe it, is none other than Alasdair Howorth, the future, the present of African football, and the man with an encyclopedic knowledge on African football. Ali, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Zayn. I have an encyclopedic knowledge until you ask me a question. So just don't. as long as you don't ask me to refer to that encyclopedia, I'm good. Nah, man, I'm good. It's always good to be on the pod. Always good to see you.
Absolutely, and we don't have the past with us, which should be Francis Nkwayin, our African football expert, and Courtney Freeze, our lovable Premier Soccer League winner. They're the past, you're the present, and the future. And today, I am the ringmaster.
Don't let them hear you say that, Zayn. They still think they're the future.
Listen, when I'm not here, they try to eat coup d'etats. So, you know what I mean? Now that the ringmaster's back behind the mic, so to speak, it's my chance to fire back some bobs. But we miss you, Francis. We miss you, Ali. Courtney, come again. And of course, we miss me not forgetting our women's football editor, Firdaus. Firdaus, come back. We need more stories about women's football on the continent. There's so many things we can tell there. But Ali, let's get into it. It's a short, sharp podcast. The big talker, undoubtedly being in African football, coming from the Sky Studios in London. What do I mean by that? Well, Jamie Carragher, the former Liverpool defender, the Liverpool legend, he said that Mohamed Salah could not win the Ballon d'Or or any major football title by just winning the AFCON. This triggered a huge backlash on social media. On air, when he said it at the time, he was making the point that for Salah to be considered the best player in the world, he has to perform at his club Liverpool, and he would have to win a major tournament. And with Egypt, he doesn't get that opportunity because he doesn't regularly feature in World Cups. And he clearly did not regard the AFCON of an equivalent status to the European Championships or the Copa America. Micah Richardson and Daniel Sturridge, who are part of that panel, corrected him, saying that the African Cup of Nations is a major tournament. I saw that, I think, at the time when I saw the comments being made at the weekend, I reacted in our WhatsApp group like so many people up there might have. And I think I said to you, Ali, was Jamie Carragher made this way or was he born this way? Because it's incredibly ignorant what he is saying. What he is saying is not an unpopular view in Europe, in the Northern Hemisphere, and perhaps for people who are not as accustomed with African football like we are. But to set the stalls out very clearly, any continental tournament, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in North or Central America or Africa, is a major tournament. The tournament that stands above them all is the World Cup. There's no distinction. The World Cup is the greatest tournament in the world because it has the greatest teams. You will never get Brazil, Uruguay, Colombia, and Argentina participating in the Euros. You're missing powerhouses. Just like you're missing African teams playing in a European competition or South American team. And I'm going to remind people that Qatar 2022 World Cup had Morocco making the semis. A fantastic advert for Africa, North Africa, and the Arab-speaking world. We also had a Morocco team that drew with Croatia, beat Belgium in the group stages, knocked out Spain, who are the European champions now, and Portugal, a former European champion, en route to that semi-final, where they would eventually get knocked out. And they would lose their third place play for a rematch against Croatia. At the very same tournament, Tunisia and Cameroon finished above European competition in their group, namely Denmark and Serbia, who are and participate in Euros and European competition, below them. This idea that the Africa Cup of Nations is not elite is not correct. It needs to go out the window. It is an equivalent competition to the Euros.
Yeah, Zayn. I mean, you've put it very well there, defending our corner. I guess I think you want to. I want to separate a couple of things because I think there's things that can be convoluted, and I want to then make it clear why I think Jamie Carragher, what he said, has been kind of so destructive, and I guess specifically him. So I mean, first of all, if Carragher is saying that the Africa Cup of Nations, in terms of the quality of players and the kind of status, is not quite at the levels of the European Championships and the World Cup, in a sense, he's right. We can't argue with that. The best teams in the world, both at club and international football, have been in Europe for a long time now, and it's continuing to be that way because the money being funneled into them. At some certain points, African countries have been a lot stronger. At certain points, South American nations have been a lot stronger. At the moment, football is very much centered around Europe, and that's why we often see a lot of pushback to Saudi Arabia getting involved in football. I think there is an element of people being worried and not feeling that it's right that European football isn't the center of football. And so in that sense, there is an element of what he's saying is true, right? Like the World Cup is the best in terms of the quality of football, the attention, and the Euros has probably come second with Copa America. I would argue alongside the AFCON coming a little bit below it. What I do then have an issue with, though, with what Jamie Carragher is saying is there's a couple things. Is his dismissal of the Africa Cup of Nations being a major tournament, because it is a major tournament. There's no two ways about it. And it's a tournament with with pedigree. It's a tournament with history. Let's not forget the Africa Cup of Nations is older than the Euros. So in terms of its history, it's got more than the
absolutely
in terms of that. I think it's a more enjoyable tournament than the Euros. Like the Euros is great, but I think the African Cup of Nations is the best tournament in the world. And this is, someone who's biased and someone, but I honestly, I ask you to give me a better tournament than this previous Africa Cup of Nations in Ivory Coast. And I even say that I don't think there will be a better Africa Cup of Nations than there was in Cote d'Ivoire last year. I hope I'm proved wrong, but it was phenomenal in terms of the storylines, the quality of football, the excitement, the kind of unique celebration of culture. I don't think you get that in the Euros, and I think that's what makes the Africa Cup of Nations different. And I think it makes it. But there's no doubt about in terms of the value of it. And his whole thing was, we're saying it's not enough for Salah to do well internationally. He's playing at a weak country, so he's not going to be considered for the Ballon d'Or. And it's weird because then in his Twitter statement, he then brought up kind of Sadio Mane to prove his point, where he's like, Sadio Mane came second in the Ballon d'Or. Oh, do we think it's because of the AFCON? Well, he definitely wouldn't have done that without winning the FA and League Cup with Liverpool. And
exactly, the success at the Africa Cup of Nations served to bolster his run that year.
Absolutely. And the point I give you with that is, I think for me that's a terrible example for his point, because if so, Mohamed Salah should have probably been above Mane, because I think he had a better season than Mane. And the one difference was that Sadio Mane was the one who lifted the Africa Cup of Nations. I don't even think he had a particularly amazing Africa Cup of Nations. For me, he wasn't brilliant, but he got the job done. He was brilliant. So I think there's an element of that where, he's wrong in terms of valuing the Africa Cup of Nations as a major tournament. But I think what's more damaging, right, is the underlying is not the explicit but the implicit. And this is something that people like you and me and those coming from the continent have always banged on about. And this is not a football specific issue. This is not a sports specific issue. This is a representation issue, is the way in which Africa has always been portrayed by Europe and the European media. I mean, this is the month that's celebrating, I think, the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Conference, when Europe, without any consultation from Africa, carved up the continent. Those scars are still there. And the representation of Africa that was there, which was zero, no Africans were involved in that Berlin Conference, that same attitude is still pervasive throughout Europe. Yes, it is better. And in the UK, it is better than a lot of other countries, but it is still not good. And it's still a gross misunderstanding of what the African continent is. And like I said, this is not a football specific issue. And I think what makes it worse is Jamie Carragher and that's why it's important that we talk about it, is Jamie Carragher has a brilliant reputation. In my opinion, he is a very good pundit. I think he's one of the best in the UK. I think his football analysis is great. I think he's a smart guy. But the fact that he can let that implicit bias of just disregarding the African Cup of Nations, because I think if he thought about it, he wouldn't have said what he said. But that's the point, is that it is that implicit and pervasive idea that Africa is less, right? In the Africa and in a footballing context, the AFCON is less, and that he doesn't even have to think it. And it's not just Jamie Carragher. You know, I listen to the Guardian Football podcast a lot. I really enjoy it. Max Rushton, another pundit I really enjoy, great host, etc. He had another massive throwaway comment about Manchester City playing Wydad AC at the Club World Cup. And again, massively disparaging comment. Yes, I know it's in part because of kind of the kind of attitudes toward the Club World Cup. But I tell you what, he wouldn't have been mispronouncing Juventus. He wouldn't have been mispronouncing Palmeiras or Fluminense or these. It was an African club that he was, disregarding. And again, I don't think Max Rushton would explicitly, consciously do that. But it's the allowance of that implicitness. And then it gives noise to these other people who do explicitly say racist things. And I don't want to mention names because I don't want to give them airtime. But for me, that is where the real damage does, is that pervasive element of implicit belittling, disregarding of African culture, African sport, and African economics even. And that's what does the damage in terms of these things, that belittling. So for me, that's why it is really destructive. And I think this, the second part of why it is, sorry, I'll let you come back in, I'm ranting a little bit, is it specifically because it is Jamie Carragher speaking about Mohamed Salah. And that's because Jamie Carragher is intrinsically connected with Liverpool, right? He is Mr. Liverpool, one Champions League, one club man. So he should know Mohamed Salah. He should know what the Africa Cup of Nations means to Mohamed Salah. And it's because the Africa Cup of Nations, whether personally or not, to Mohamed Salah in terms of his legacy, is more important than perhaps any other tournament to any other player since Messi won the World Cup. And that is because Egypt as a country has two things. A, it's intrinsically connected with the Africa Cup of Nations because they've won it 7 times. They've been to the semifinals another 4 or 5 times. The finals, rather. They've been to the semifinals another, I think, 5 or 6 times, so that's 20 plus appearances in the finals or semifinals. They are the AFCON team. And so for Mohamed Salah to win it, and then the second part of that is that Egypt is a football mad country, right? There is no other country in this world, I would say, aside from perhaps Brazil, that has both the size of population and the football culture as Egypt, right? They are football mad. Bear in mind, Manchester City playing Liverpool, 2 teams playing in the English Premier League. There's 2 Egyptians playing there, right, Zayn? Yes. It's estimated about 100 million Egyptians watched or listened to that game.
Wow. Incredible.
Right? For context, the UK population, I think, is 67 million, under 70 million. So more than the entirety of the UK was watching or listening to it in Egypt alone. And so for Egyptians, although Mohamed Salah is by far the best player that has ever come out of Egypt, phenomenal player, in terms of his legacy, it will never be crowned, despite him getting to 2 AFCONs, which I think is harsh. I don't think it's fair, but he will never be crowned above the likes of Mohamed Aboutrika, Hassan Hassan, these guys who have won the AFCON and have won it multiple times. And so for Jamie Carragher to be someone intrinsically connected to Mo Salah, I know people, the rumors that they don't get on and etc. But for him to be connected to him specifically in that way and to be that ignorant, that is what makes it important that it's him. Not just any old pundit. It's the fact that he's a high profile, very good pundit who should know better, because he should know about Mohamed Salah. And for him to not understand that context, that is what makes it really damaging for me. That's what makes it so bad.
And the fact that he doesn't know the context and he's being corrected by Micah Richards and Daniel Sturridge, and then still doesn't have the awareness to then go, you know what, I need to check myself and clarify what I mean, or to take a step back and go, you know what, I need to take a step back and figure this out. I think shows the ignorance. Yeah. And it took him a considerable period of time to respond on his social platforms because of the storm that it had kicked up. There were people like Rio Ferdinand in I would argue, a clumsy way on Rio Presents that criticized him because, it was very clear when Rio was making the argument, he was saying that he takes what Jamie says and he understands that that's a common argument here. But Rio himself, you could see, lacks some knowledge on African football. That's not I think, a criticism of him. I think just the reality of where he is. But I've also seen, and I will say this, we've seen the likes of, Joey Barton, who has a very big following with conservative, right wing, I would dare say, consumers, conspiracy theorists. Joey was saying that there's three competitions in the world of equivalent status. It's the World Cup, it's the Euros, shock horror, and it's the Copa America, because I think the Western world loves to fetishize anything that comes out of South America without thinking too much about it. So he's made that argument. And he was also pointing to the fact that at previous AFCONs, there might have been issues around security, like we had with Togo. Okay. But in that instance, when we had the issues with Togo, I remember at the time, that wasn't an AFCON issue. That was a Togo issue per se, and how their travels were taking place. It wasn't necessarily something to do with organization. However, I think I'm getting sort of lost in the point here. What Joey is missing, and others are missing, I attended the Euros that took place all over Europe, but the unofficial HQ was the United Kingdom, when England played Italy in the final, and you had fans storming in at Wembley. That happened there. You have had homophobic abuse at Euros. You have had racist abuse at Euros. And at the Euros that were held in France, you had the hooliganism that harked back to the 80s with some of the fighting that was going on between the Russian sort of combat militant hooligans who had come over and some of the other nations like England and Wales. It was incredible. Those pictures, you can go and Google them. You can still probably find them on social media. They're there. So the fact that Joey doesn't acknowledge that shows what a myopic view he has of the world and of these tournaments. And Alasdair, I'll put to you, because he's been retweeting some people from Africa who are supportive of his view. There are other people on other platforms who are African football fans or commentators or analysts or influencers who are agreeing with Jamie and who are agreeing with Joey. Has it surprised you that there've been a swathe of opinion that has gone that way?
No, I don't think so, and I think it is, in many ways, it's such a difficult topic to get into, Zayn, and people much smarter than us should be the ones speaking on this. I would say, in terms of that kind of really strange dynamic and very neo-colonial dynamic that we see in a lot of African countries and a lot of African attitudes of this idea of like selling ourselves to Europeans and talking about Europe as if it's some amazing place. It's worse in some countries than others, and there's lots of dynamics about this. Kenya is a big country that's like this, where people kind of almost affiliate themselves more with Europeans than their fellow Africans and fellow Kenyans in our case, and it's kind of, there's a lot of neo-colonial reasons for that, in terms of the power that's been drawn out of Africa, the power that's been drawn out of these countries, and the kind of the intentional corruption of countries. We've seen it recently in our own country with Kemi Badenoch's comments, who's the leader of the Conservatives, the opposition, and her absolute kind of denigration of Nigeria as a country, and her wanting to distance herself from Nigeria, and kind of how shameful that is. And I think there are, again, you can take those 2 points as separate, right? You don't have to conflate them. With Carragher, with other people, we can be critical of whether it's a African government, African state, African football governing organization, CAF. We can be critical of them, and at the same time not let these other pervasive and dangerous narratives come into it, whether it's racism, these neo-colonial attitudes, and the attitudes that it's almost like intrinsic to Africa. Oh, CAF is corrupt. Why? Well, because it's an African organization. No, CAF is corrupt because of very specific things. A huge one being FIFA's influence. FIFA headed up by a white European, and so I think there's a lot of things like that that we can get into. And I think, again, a lot of Africans have kind of come down on that side with Jamie Carragher of saying, oh, well, he's right, AFCON isn't as good as the Euros, and again, that is correct in terms of the quality of football, but that doesn't make his point entirely valid. We can separate that from the disregarding of it. We can separate that from the kind of disparaging remarks, and particularly his disparaging reaction. Like you said, I think that's quite an important part of this. And I know someone who knows Jamie Carragher quite well, and who's saying that, yes, like when Jamie Carragher did that whole thing where he went, oh God, when Micah Richards came back to him, he was kind of, it wasn't because he was disparaging the AFCON, it was because he knew of the storm that would come to him on the internet. And while I do take that, again, for me, it's the implicit. He wouldn't have done that if he accidentally made that faux pas with Brazil. You know, and he had the opportunity to say, yeah, no, of course, I don't mean that Africa Cup of Nations is not a major tournament, because that's a classic thing that pundits are often given the chance to do. And Micah Richards very much gave him the chance to do that, is to say, not apologize or anything, but just quickly correct and say, oh, that's, obviously I don't mean that the Africa Cup of Nations isn't a major tournament. And he, instead of doing that, he rolled his eyes, he scoffed, and he said, oh God. So I think from an African perspective, right, and, again, it's for much smarter people than us to say, and this issue is probably more pertinent to us because we're Africans who live in the UK, so we're kind of caught in between that those two worlds. Is there's an element of, do we we need to be critical of our own, right? We need to be the ones who are, confronting CAF, because I think we then have this problem in African media circles and football circles where we do one of two things, right? And neither of which are productive. Either we completely sell ourselves to CAF, or whichever African country is paying us to speak well of them, this is perfect, this is amazing, there's nothing wrong with this, this is this and that. Or we completely disregard everything and say CAF is useless, it's corrupt, African football is corrupt, this is terrible, And the reality is neither of those are true, and they're both true, right? Is we have to be in a place where we are the ones being critical of our own, saying we need to do this better. But I think there's also an element of the need to defend our own, because we're fighting against these narratives, and this is something Francis talks about so much, is that kind of defending our own, defending the continent whilst being critical of ourselves. I think there is an element of, I think we need some of that attitude, is not brazenly just calling Jamie Carragher a racist, because I don't think he is. Joey Barton is, Jamie Carragher isn't, but also holding him to account and defending what we have. And again, I don't like the people who are coming down, because I've then seen a lot of content of people coming down and defending the AFCON, but naively, kind of like you're saying about Rio Ferdinand, just saying, oh no, it's amazing because of the vibes and because it's Africa. And, no, it's amazing because of very specific reasons. Or even I saw someone talking about like, oh, just because you hate that it's in January. Well, have you ever tried to, play in Africa in the summer? It's too hot. And I was like, my brother, like, Africa's on the equator. We don't play to a European summer, right? The reason we don't play in the European summer isn't because it's too hot in Africa. It's because it's rainy season in most of Africa. So things like that, where it's like, we can't defend it naively. We can't, have our blinkers on. But I also think there's an element of defending our own, fighting for our own. And that's so much of what we do on this podcast, right? That's something we always harp on about, is pushing that narrative and changing that narrative, not so that we can't be critical, not so that we can't embed ourselves,
we've got,
but because we don't have that.
But
yeah,
to your point and what you were making earlier, Alasdair, I think this idea that Europe gets it right all the time, there are countless examples when they don't. They've not got a hold or across homophobia, racism, and forms of gender discrimination and sexism. And they're progressive societies in the West, and they're not fully across that.
Absolutely. And
go to the North London Derby, and I challenge you not to hear people making gas chamber noises.
100%.
I challenge you. There's my challenge. Go there and experience it yourself, and see what you hear, and listen to what you hear. So this idea that, like, again, I think the final point that I want to make is, we can talk about the pitches being bad. We can talk about the infrastructure not being there, whether that's training facilities, hotels, airports, roads, whatever they are, right? But you've also got to look at the countries that are hosting and the very real issues that they have of trying to support their populations with hospitals, with infrastructure that they're probably failing at in a lot of ways. And some of it is historical, and some of it is bad management, and some of it is just a lack of money and resources, right? It's complicated. It's not one or the other in most cases. So when you're looking at a pitch and you're going, well, that pitch isn't of European standards, like sometimes you've got to realize that there's going to be that inconsistency when country X or Y hosts. Okay? Like that's just going to be the reality of it. And you got to look past it. And you don't have to make excuses for it. But that's the reality of where we are. Okay? Where we can be more critical is if federations are not taking their funding and paying for flights and hotels and taking bloated delegations. That's where we can hold more of the accountability to, right? We can hold accountability when a referee blows the game 20 minutes short, okay? And we can call that out. And we can talk about how odd it looks. And we can call out things like that. But people in Europe have to get over the fact that their domestic leads do not mean more than continental showpieces, whether it's the AFCON, which is biennial, or the Asian Cup, which is quadrennial. These are celebrations of football. These are festivals of football. And our heroes should be celebrated and respected for trying to do something for their countries and their nations.
And I think that's spot on, Zayn. And again, when we are having these conversations, when we're talking about things, we're not saying, oh, the AFCON is better than the Euros. The AFCON is better than the world. It is not trying to put ourselves above Europe. It's none of that. But what it is trying to do is it's trying to address this narrative that is so imbalanced. And if you question that narrative, if you question it, what I dare you to do is to go back to the biggest publications across Europe, look at the stories that they cover about the AFCON, okay? Because I guarantee you they'll be covering way more Gianni Sikazwe blowing up his whistle early or issues with the Cameroonian pitches. And those things should be covered. But it's the disproportionate coverage of those things. And it's the lack of coverage of, say, for instance, how well run this last AFCON that I was at in Cote d'Ivoire was, you know? But when you hear about the greatness of the last AFCON, it's not about the standard. It's just about the generic intrinsic things to Africa. Oh, the color, you know, the Ivorian people, their passion, you know, it's that kind of, oh, it's the AFCON. You just shoot from wherever and it goes in, you know, like, it's the coverage in which is just dripping in a kind of a patronizing condescension that is what we're trying to fight against. And that's why ultimately criticizing Jamie Carragher, not calling him racist because I don't think he is, but pointing it out and holding to account, because it's saying, look, this is someone who is excellent at his job, who is at the top, and they have these implicit biases. And so if you have that at the very top, what does the rest of it look like? And it is bad and it is dangerous. And I think that's kind of what we're ultimately getting at. And that's why I think this conversation is important.
Absolutely. And for those of you who want to join the discussion, share your thoughts with us. OTW_podcast at X, formerly Twitter. You can find the same handle on Instagram. And you can search for us on Facebook and in YouTube. Just search for the On the Whistle podcast. Leave a comment, leave a review. Let us know what you think. This was meant to be a bite-sized, pint-sized edition. It's turned into a lot more than that because it shows you there's a lot to get stuck into. We'd love to hear from you. Alasdair, as always, excellent analysis. Can't wait to chop it up with you soon. And for those of you listening out there, get in touch. We want to hear from you.